This video will showcase the creation of a miniature facade of a townhouse. I did not document the build, but will discuss the process used to construct the model. I had this idea to build a miniature of a row house, like the ones you find in older urban cities in the US. Since there is so much architectural interest in the front of these buildings, I wanted this to be a study of just the front facade. I have been saving images of older townhomes that are typically located in eastern US cities like New York City. However, I decided to build a miniature of a townhome located in St. Louis. I've been following the YouTube channel The Second Empire Strikes Back, which chronicles the work to restore an 1889-1890 Second Empire home in St. Louis, Missouri. Kaleb and Kim continue to put in a lot of effort to restore the old house and to preserve a bit of history. I was so inspired that I decided to model my miniature on their house. I will also put a link to this YouTube channel in the description below. PowerPoint helped get me started. I pulled images from the internet of an early image of the house and one more current. I decided that I wanted to keep the house no larger than a legal size paper, about 17 inches in height. So then I roughly worked out this to be a 1/24 scale model. I then scaled my PowerPoint page size to accommodate the 17-inch high model so that I could create the layout to actual size. With the image of the house, I rotated this on the y-axis to remove some of the perspective skew and create an image with more vertical oblique perspective. This resulted in an image that was about 16.5 inches in height. I had previously built and documented the construction of the stone house that can be found on my YouTube channel. This was primarily constructed with foam core board, and I decided the construction of this model house would also be perfect for foam core. I had some sheets left over and also used various components that I had on hand to complete the construction. I did have to obtain some foam sheets used for the shingles and window frames since I could not find my old ones. I knew I needed a flat backing for the model, so I drew out the silhouette of the house and took measurements. I made a decision to keep the depth narrow so this could easily be hung on the wall. For the bay window tower, I drew out a support depth of 1 inch and worked out the size of the panels that would be used for the facade. I then laid out the window and door openings. Next, I worked out how the mansard roof was to be constructed. PowerPoint did not provide me with the flexibility to determine the dimensions of the sloping roof panels, so the roof panels were constructed on the working model. With the drawings at hand, I began cutting out the pieces of the foam core board and assembling. I typically used tacky glue to attach the panels, but additionally white glue was used. I did not document the construction since I was not sure how well this would actually go, but I did get this one image of the core assembly. The bay tower is supported with 3 underlying wedges, bottom, top, and middle of the bay. The roof is supported by a lower 2-ply board frame that juts out from and mirrors the shape of the house. There is an inner support that sits just above the 2 boards that is just slightly smaller in dimension and allows the sloping roof panels to rest. At the top of the mansard roof tower, there is a smaller wedge for the roof panels to rest. The left and the right side roof panels slope to the backside foam board panel. As I mentioned, the dimension of the roof panels were determined on the working model. I would first Work out the panel by placing a paper on the area and marking the intersecting points. The paper models were then transferred to the foam board. Then the roof components were assembled and glued. The roof, bay tower, and side panels of the house were not glued to the backside foam board until much later. I needed access to the inside of the bay tower to later install the windows. Strips of foam core were positioned under the windows and foundation perimeter to provide the desired architectural interest. The windows and doors were framed with the coffee stirrers, and skewers were used to mimic the round details at the foundation. Next, the dimensions of the mansard dormer windows were worked out on PowerPoint. The components were cut and assembled from the foam core and set aside. The sides of the dormers were determined on the working model of the roof to get the right slope. I decided that the left side dormer window was too big and later cut this down in height to better fit the roof. For the shingles, I determined a layout that would not be too tedious to cut. This was to be cut out of the red foam sheets. I decided to use a layout where the edges of the shingles could be cut next to another row of shingles. Making these small cuts in the foam sheets was not easy with the X-Acto knife. The foam tends to stretch and makes the cuts challenging. To mimic the layout of the shingles of the actual house, the rows of shingles are overlapped to create a hexagon-shaped pattern. The entire roof was shingled before the dormers were applied to make the roofing easier. I struggled a bit with the corbels found under each of the window sills. At the time I purchased the foam sheets, I picked up some modeling clay. I attempted to shape these with the clay, but never liked the outcome. Instead, I cut small 1/4 inch strips of the foam board, then cut these into small pieces to fit the desired dimensions. Using the edge of the metal ruler, I first creased the foam to form the upper portion of the corbel. Next, I pressed the other end to compress the bottom and taper. This created a reasonable facsimile of the corbel that I could live with. The body of the house is constructed with limestone. I decided to mix some sand with paint to provide a subtle texture to the house body. I used some leftover paint that was already a cement color. I probably should have added some additional tints to give this a more yellow hue. The window glass was created from cellophane, and the window frames are cut from the foam sheet. I mentally debated how to create the window frame, but opted for a simple single layer where the frames are cut out for the glass openings. I did not find black foam sheet at the time, so I had to paint the blue foam sheet black to achieve the final result. I cut up a black cardboard shoebox and placed on the inside of each window to mask the interior. The central windows of the tower have a center support. For this, I cut a small strip of the foam core board. The small decorative corbels were created much like the other corbels of the facade. The ends were compressed using the metal ruler to create a tapered shape. For the gutter, I found some leftover chair rail molding that I first cut in half lengthwise. To get the angles, I devised a method of positioning strips of paper along the front face just below the roof line where the molding would sit. The intersecting points of the strips would represent the angles. Using a miter saw, I transferred the angles to the saw and cut the trim molding. I had to use wood filler to close up the gaps. For the top of the roof, I found some leftover trim molding from the Beacon Hill dollhouse with none to spare. This mimicked the molding used on the house image. For the detail just below this crown molding, I finally decided to use some mesh-like shelf liner. I cut out the lacy part of the opening, then painted this white along with the crown molding. Just under the guttering, I started with a strip of foam sheet that was glued to the front facade. For the half-round corbels, I used some small bottle caps that were cut into quarters. The cavity was filled with a piece of foam board and covered with foam sheet. For the dentil molding between the corbels, I went back to the shelf liner and cut out strips of the nubby elements. Then, just under the foam sheet, I used spaghetti to create the detail from the house image. Everything was then given a coat of white paint. The steps were created using layers of foam core. I tried to keep this from protruding no further from the surface than the bay, since this may be hung from the wall. The steps were covered with foam sheets to smooth out the foam board layers. For the paint, I used the same paint as the house body, but mixed this with some white to create a lighter version. For the door, I looked back at the older house image. This revealed one side of the original paneled exterior double door. It was a bit obscured, but I used this as inspiration to create the double door with raised panel detail. I used PowerPoint to help lay out the dimensions required for the panels. I started with a piece of foam board cut to fit into the door opening. Next, a piece of foam sheet was cut to fit over the foam board, and the panel openings were cut out. I wanted some sort of framing of each panel opening, tried a few options, but ultimately used spaghetti for the interior edge of each panel. Then 2 layers of foam sheet was cut for each raised panel, one just slightly smaller in dimension to create the tapered panel effect. This was then treated with a coat of primer, then antique white, then several layers of mahogany stain. A skewer was used to create the molding detail for the door overlap in the center. To facilitate the hanging of the model, I used a reinforcement that came off an old bracket. This was glued just behind the area with the layered roof support, and a small cavity was carved into the keyhole. Alright, well, thanks for watching.